Grace pushed open the glass door of the private hospital, her heels striking fast against the polished floor, a gift bag swinging from her wrist. She had baked Daniel's favorite meat pie that morning, packed it carefully, and driven across town just to surprise him after his appointment. Her heart was light. Today felt different. Today felt like the kind of day she wanted to remember. She turned the corner toward the consultation wing and slowed near a half-closed door, recognizing two voices inside. "Grace can never know," Daniel was saying, his voice low and strained. "Not until the baby comes," Ada answered. "Once there's a child, everything will be easier. She'll understand. Eventually." Grace stopped walking. The gift bag slipped from her fingers and landed soundlessly on the carpet. "My husband?" she whispered to herself, her voice barely escaping her throat. She pressed her palm against the wall to steady herself, her mind refusing to process what her ears had just delivered. That was Ada's voice. That was unmistakably Ada. And the second voice, calm, familiar, the voice she had fallen asleep next to for 10 years, that was Daniel. She did not move. She did not breathe. She simply stood there as her entire world quietly began to crumble behind a door she had not yet opened. If you've ever discovered something that shattered everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you, stay with this story till the end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Before we continue, take a second to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It truly helps this channel grow. 6 months earlier, Grace's life looked nothing like the storm that was about to consume it. She and Daniel had been married for 10 years. Their love story was the kind people pointed to as proof that good marriages still existed. Daniel was attentive. He remembered her birthday without being reminded. He called her in the afternoon just to ask if she had eaten. He held her hand in public, even after a decade of marriage, even when no one was watching. But there was one wound that lived quietly beneath their happiness, a wound neither of them spoke about, unless they had to. They had no children. Grace had been pregnant 4 times. 4 times she had felt the fragile flutter of hope inside her, and 4 times that hope had been taken from her in hospital rooms that smelled of antiseptic and disappointment. Each loss had cracked something in her, but somehow each loss had also drawn her and Daniel closer. He never blamed her. After the 3rd miscarriage, he had knelt beside her hospital bed, held her hand, and said quietly, "Grace, look at me. I didn't marry you to have children. I married you because you're you. We will figure this out together, however long it takes." She had believed him completely. What she did not know was that there was someone else in their lives who refused to let the matter rest, Daniel's mother. Mama Daniel was a woman who measured worth in grandchildren. To her, a marriage without children was not a marriage at all. It was an unfinished project, an embarrassment she had to explain away at every family gathering. "Where is the child?" she would ask loudly, in front of relatives, in front of neighbors, in front of anyone who would listen. 10 years, and nothing to show for it. Grace would sit through these moments with her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap, swallowing the humiliation like bitter medicine. One Sunday afternoon, after church, Mama Daniel arrived unannounced, trailing 2 young women behind her like prizes she intended to present. "Daniel, meet Blessing, and this is Comfort. Both from good families, both fertile, healthy women." Grace stood frozen at the doorway, the wooden spoon still in her hand from the soup she had been stirring. "Mama, please," Daniel said, his voice tight with embarrassment. "Grace is my wife." "And what has your wife given you in 10 years? Tell me." "What?" "That's enough," Daniel said firmly, ushering the confused young women back toward the gate. "I will not have this conversation again." That night, lying in bed, Grace turned to him in the darkness. "Daniel, maybe we should consider adoption. There are children who need homes, who need love. We have so much love to give." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I've thought about it too. But you know my mother. She'll never accept a child that isn't our blood, as she calls it. Then what do? We keep trying. We keep believing. A month later, Daniel finally agreed to see a fertility specialist, though only for Grace's sake, and only reluctantly. The results came back, and the doctor sat both of them down. Mrs. Okonkwo's tests show no clear reason for the repeated losses at this stage. Mr. Okonkwo, I'd also like to run a full panel on you. It's standard procedure when a couple has struggled this long. Daniel shifted in his seat. Is that really necessary? Grace is the one who's been losing the pregnancies. That doesn't rule out a male factor contributing to early loss, the doctor said gently. I'd strongly recommend it. Daniel never went back for that second appointment. Later that week, his mother had cornered him in the kitchen, her voice low and certain. Why would you let a doctor poke and prod you like a sick man? A real man doesn't need fertility tests, Daniel. The problem is clearly with her body, not yours. Don't let her confuse you. Daniel told himself his mother was right. It was easier than facing a needle and a waiting room and the possibility of an answer he didn't want. He buried the doctor's recommendation at the bottom of a drawer and never mentioned it to Grace again. It was a quiet decision, made in a single afternoon, but it would cost more than he could have imagined. The pressure from his mother did not relent. If anything, it sharpened. She began showing up at his office unannounced, calling him at odd hours, reminding him constantly that the Okonkwo name needed an heir before she died without seeing her grandchild's face. You are wasting your life on a woman who cannot give you what you need, she told him one evening, gripping his hand across the dinner table. I am not saying leave her, I am saying think. Think before it is too late for you too. Daniel began pulling away from himself, if such a thing were possible, pulling away from his own certainty, his own promises. He started staying later at work, not because there was more to do, but because home had started to feel like a place where he was failing at something he couldn't fix. He stopped sleeping well. He stopped laughing the way he used to. Grace noticed the change in him, but assumed it was grief, the same grief she carried. It was during this fragile, exhausted season that Ada began spending more time with him. Ada had loved Daniel long before Grace ever met him. It was a secret she had buried for 15 years, ever since university, when Daniel had chosen her quiet, soft-spoken roommate over her. She had told herself, at the time, that it didn't matter, that friendship would be enough, that watching him build a life with someone else would eventually stop hurting if she just gave it time. It never fully did. She simply learned to wear her loyalty to Grace like armor over a wound that never closed. For years, Ada was genuinely Grace's friend. She cried with her after every miscarriage. She prayed with her. She meant it, every time. But somewhere beneath that loyalty, a small, persistent voice had never stopped whispering that if circumstances had been different, she might have been the one Daniel chose. When Daniel began confiding in her, about his mother's pressure, about his fear that he was failing as a husband, about nights he couldn't sleep, that old wound reopened. You're not failing anyone, Ada told him one evening, after he'd called her in a low moment, unable to face going home. You've carried so much, Daniel, anyone would be struggling. I don't know how much longer I can watch her hope and then watch it break again, he admitted. I don't know how much longer I can be the one who can't fix it. Ada said nothing for a long moment. Then, carefully, gently, the way a person tests whether a door is truly unlocked, she said, what if it isn't about fixing it the way everyone expects? What if there's another way to give your mother peace without losing what you and Grace have built? What are you saying? I'm saying people do it quietly sometimes. A second, private arrangement. No one needs to know until there's something to show for it. Once there's a child, the pressure stops. Grace could even come to accept it in time, if it meant the end of the suffering for both of you. Daniel recoiled. Ada, are you hearing yourself? I love my wife. I would never betray her like that. But the seed had been planted, and seeds planted in exhausted, Desperate soil rarely stay dormant for long. Mama Daniel, sensing her son's wavering resolve, pressed harder in the weeks that followed. "Take another wife quietly," she urged one night, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "No one needs to know immediately. Mama, are you hearing yourself?" Daniel snapped, though with less conviction than the first time she'd suggested it. "We shall see," she murmured, smiling the smile of a woman who had heard no before and never once accepted it as final. Months passed. Daniel sank deeper into a quiet depression he didn't have words for. He began traveling more, taking work trips that lasted longer than necessary, simply to avoid the silence of his own home and the weight of his own guilt. Each time he returned, Ada was there, patient, understanding, careful never to push too hard, always letting him come back to the idea on his own. It was Ada, in the end, who arranged everything quietly, a small registry signing, witnessed by no one but a clerk and her own racing heart, 3 months before Grace would ever discover the truth. Daniel told himself it was temporary, a private arrangement that would solve everything without truly hurting anyone. He told himself many things that winter that he would later be unable to forgive himself for believing. Grace, meanwhile, began to notice changes she could not quite name. Daniel started traveling more for business. His phone, which used to lie carelessly on the dining table, now stayed in his pocket at all times. And Ada slowly began to disappear from her life, always with an excuse ready. "I've just been so busy with work, Grace. You know how it is. Ada, we used to talk every single day. Now I barely hear from you. I'm sorry. I promise I'll make it up to you, soon." Grace believed her, because why wouldn't she? Ada had never given her a reason to doubt her loyalty. Not once in 15 years of friendship. Which brings us back to that hospital corridor, to the gift bag lying forgotten on the carpet, to Grace standing frozen outside a half-closed door, finally hearing the truth her instincts had been circling for months. She did not burst into the room. She simply turned, picked up the gift bag with trembling hands, and walked back to her car, where she sat for nearly an hour before she could make herself drive home. That night, she said nothing to Daniel. She watched him eat dinner, watched him kiss her forehead before bed, watched him sleep beside her as though nothing in the world had changed, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that she needed proof before she said a single word. It came 2 days later, while searching through Daniel's old briefcase for a document he had asked her to find. Her fingers brushed against a sealed envelope, tucked beneath a stack of papers. She opened it. Inside was a marriage certificate. Daniel Okonkwo, Ada Chukwuma, legally married, 3 months prior. Her hands began to tremble as she read the names printed in official, unfeeling font. She read it once, then again, then a third time, as though repetition would somehow change the words on the page. She sat on the cold floor of their bedroom for what felt like hours, the certificate clutched against her chest, replaying every late-night phone call, every sudden business trip, every excuse Ada had ever given her for disappearing, and finally understanding what they had all been hiding. That evening, when Daniel walked through the front door, he found his wife sitting in the dark living room, the certificate resting on the coffee table in front of her, like an unexploded bomb. "Grace, sit down," she said, her voice eerily calm, "and tell me everything. I deserve that much." Daniel sank into the chair across from her, his hands shaking as he rubbed them over his face. "I never stopped loving you," he began. "You have to believe that. Tell me the truth, Daniel, not what you think will hurt me less. The truth." He exhaled slowly. "My mother kept pushing. Every day, it was about an heir, about the family name. I went quiet. I stopped sleeping. And Ada was there when I couldn't talk to anyone else. She said if I just had a child, even with her, it would take the pressure off you, off us. She said you would never need to know until it was already done, until there was a baby to soften the blow. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was protecting you. You weren't protecting me, Daniel. You were protecting yourself from having to be honest. He had no answer for that, because there wasn't one. Grace turned her head toward the doorway, where Ada now stood, having let herself in with the spare key Grace had given her years ago, back when keys meant trust, back when friendship meant something sacred. Ada, Grace said quietly, 15 years. Tell me there's some explanation that makes this make sense. Ada's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of remorse alone. I loved him first, Grace. Before you ever met him. I never stopped. I told myself it didn't matter, that I could just be your friend and let that be enough. But it was never enough. When he started struggling, when he needed someone, I couldn't stop myself from being that person for him. So all those nights you sat with me after every miscarriage, were they real, or were you just waiting? They were real, Ada whispered. That's the part I can't forgive myself for. I loved you both. I just loved him more than I could control. I'm pregnant, Ada added, the words landing in the room like a physical blow. Grace closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something in her had already changed, a quiet, final closing of a door that could never be reopened. She stood, walked to the bedroom alone, and began packing a single suitcase with slow, deliberate movements. On her way out, she paused by the small room down the hall, the nursery they had painted a soft yellow years earlier, after her first pregnancy, before they understood how much grief that color would eventually hold. She opened the door. The room had long since been converted into a storage space, but tucked in the corner of the closet, still in its original box, sat a tiny pair of baby shoes, the first thing they had ever bought too early, bought with a hope neither of them had been able to protect. Grace sank to the floor of the empty nursery, clutching the small shoes to her chest, and wept in a way she had not allowed herself to weep in years, not for the marriage that was ending, but for every version of motherhood she had been promised and denied. When she finally stood, she placed the shoes gently back in their box, closed the closet, and walked out of that house for the last time. She picked up her handbag from the side table on her way through the living room, walked past Daniel and Ada without another word, and stepped out into the cool night air, leaving behind 10 years of marriage, 15 years of friendship, and a version of herself who had once believed that love was always enough. This is exactly the kind of story we love sharing here. Real emotions, real betrayals, real lessons. If this is resonating with you, take a moment to like this video and drop a comment. If you were in Grace's position, would you have stayed to fight or walked away like she did? Let's talk about it below. Grace filed for divorce within the month, and this time there was no version of her willing to be talked out of it. She moved through the legal process with a quiet, dignified resolve that surprised even her own lawyer. Most clients want to fight for everything, her lawyer remarked. You're not asking for much. I don't want his money, Grace replied. I want my peace. When the divorce was finalized, Grace did something she had never done before. She left. She sold her share of the house, packed 2 suitcases, and moved to another state entirely, far from the city that held every memory of Daniel, every street corner that reminded her of Ada. The first year alone was the hardest. There were nights she sat alone in her small new apartment, asking herself the same question over and over. What did I do wrong? Why wasn't I enough? But slowly, she began to understand something important. She had not failed. She had simply trusted people who were not worthy of that trust. The fault had never been hers to carry. She threw herself into work, took on a new role at a logistics company, and began rebuilding her identity from the ground up. It was at this new company, almost 2 years after her divorce, that she met Michael. Michael was a widower, quiet and unassuming, who had lost his first wife to illness 3 years prior. He did not pursue Grace aggressively. He simply showed up, consistently, kindly, week after week. I'm not in a place to trust anyone right now, Grace told him honestly, the first time he asked her to dinner. Then we won't call it a date, Michael said with a gentle smile. We'll call it dinner between 2 colleagues who happen to enjoy each other's company. It took nearly a year before Grace allowed herself to fall in love again. Unlike Daniel, Michael never once mentioned children as a condition of their relationship. "Grace, I love you for who you are. If we have children, I'll be grateful. If we don't, I'll still consider myself the luckiest man alive to have you." They married 2 years later, in a small, intimate ceremony with close friends and a handful of new family members Grace had carefully chosen for herself. A year into their marriage, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She sat in the bathroom of their home, staring at the test in her trembling hands, terrified to hope, after everything hope had cost her in the past. "Michael," she called out, her voice shaking. He came running, expecting the worst. Instead, he found his wife sitting on the bathroom floor, tears streaming down her face, holding up a test with 2 pink lines. "We're going to be okay," he murmured into her hair. "Whatever happens, we're going to be okay." 9 months later, Grace gave birth to a healthy baby girl. 18 months after that, she gave birth to a son. For the first time since that night in the empty nursery, Grace knew peace. Meanwhile, back in the city she had left behind, life had moved on for Daniel and Ada, though "moved on" would prove a generous description of what was actually happening behind their closed doors. Their son was born 7 months after Grace's departure, and for a brief, glittering moment, it seemed as though everything Mama Daniel had wanted had finally arrived. "Finally!" Mama Daniel declared at the naming ceremony, cradling her grandson with tears of joy streaming down her face. "Finally, this family has an heir." But Mama Daniel did not retreat into quiet contentment once her grandson arrived. If anything, she became a more constant presence in their home than she had ever been in Grace's. She called every week, sometimes daily, demanding updates, demanding visits, insisting the boy be brought to her at the slightest excuse. "You are not raising him the way I raised Daniel," she told Ada more than once, inspecting the boy's clothes, his meals, his bedtime. Grace at least knew how to keep a quiet home. "You argue too much in front of him." "My name is Ada, Mama," Ada said once, her patience worn thin. "I know your name," Mama Daniel replied coolly. "I am only saying, Grace would never have spoken to me the way you just did." It was a bitter, ironic twist that neither Daniel nor Ada had anticipated, that the very woman whose pressure had driven them together would spend the years that followed comparing Ada unfavorably to the wife she had once worked so hard to replace. Beneath the surface of their household, beneath the celebrations and the photographs, something essential was missing from Daniel and Ada's marriage, something that cannot be manufactured no matter how badly 2 people want it: trust. Daniel could not look at Ada without remembering that she had been complicit in deceiving his wife for months. And Ada could not look at Daniel without wondering whether he had truly chosen her or whether she had simply been a convenient solution to a problem he wanted solved. Arguments became frequent, often erupting over the smallest things. "Where were you?" Ada demanded one evening as Daniel walked through the door past 9 o'clock. "I told you I had a meeting that ran late. Just like the meetings you used to have with me, before Grace found out." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Don't do that, Ada. Don't compare yourself to what we did to her." "Why not? We're living the consequences of it every single day, Daniel. Don't pretend you don't feel it too." He did feel it. He felt it every time he looked at his son and sensed, despite himself, the absence of the wife who should have been raising him alongside him. Neither of them ever fully forgave the other for how their marriage had begun, and that unspoken resentment grew like mold in the dark corners of their home. Years passed this way. Their son grew into a curious, energetic boy, blissfully unaware of the storm that had birthed his existence, until the day everything changed. It started with a fever that wouldn't break, then fatigue that kept the boy from school for days, then bruises that appeared without explanation, scattered across his small arms and legs. The family doctor, alarmed, referred them immediately to a specialist. We need to run several tests, the specialist explained, including genetic testing, to rule out hereditary conditions before we determine the best course of treatment. Genetic testing? Is that really necessary? For the treatment we're considering, yes. It's standard procedure to confirm biological parentage and rule out hereditary factors. 2 weeks later, Daniel and Ada sat in the specialist's office, waiting for results that would determine their son's treatment plan. The doctor entered with a folder in her hands and an expression that immediately told them something was wrong. "Mr. and Mrs. Okonkwo, I need to discuss something sensitive before we proceed." "What is it?" Ada asked. "Is he going to be okay?" "Medically, with the right treatment, he has an excellent prognosis, but the genetic testing revealed something that complicates our process. Mr. Okonkwo, the results indicate you are not the biological father of this child." Daniel let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "That's not possible. There must be some mistake. Run the test again." "We already ran it twice, given the sensitivity of the results." "Run it a third time then. I'm telling you, there's an error somewhere." The doctor said nothing. She simply slid the report across the desk toward him. Daniel picked it up slowly. His eyes moved down the page once, then again, searching for some technical language he could misread, some loophole that would let him put the paper down and laugh again. He found none. His hands began to shake, first faintly, then visibly, the paper trembling between his fingers until the words on it blurred. The room went completely silent. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade into the background of his hearing. He looked up slowly, not at the doctor, but at Ada. "Ada," he said quietly, dangerously quiet, "what is she talking about?" Ada's hands began to shake. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not look away. "I need to tell you something," she whispered. "Something I should have told you years ago. Tell me now. Before we got married, before everything happened with Grace, I overheard your mother talking to your old doctor friend. She told him your numbers were severely low. I was terrified that if I married you hoping for a child, I would fail too, and your mother would push you toward yet another woman. So I went to a fertility specialist, privately. I used a donor. I never told you. I told myself it didn't matter, that all that mattered was giving you the heir your mother demanded." Daniel stood up so abruptly his chair toppled backward, clattering against the floor. "You let me believe this was my son for 7 years, he said, his voice shaking with fury and heartbreak in equal measure. "You let my mother celebrate. You let me hold him the night he was born and feel like my life finally meant something, and the entire time you knew it was a lie. I did it because I loved you, because I wanted to give you what you wanted. Don't you dare say you did this out of love. You did this out of fear, and the same desperation to please my mother that destroyed my first marriage. You're no different from her." The specialist quietly excused herself, leaving the shattered remains of a marriage to fall apart in privacy. That same week, in a cruel twist neither of them had anticipated, an entirely separate revelation surfaced, one that would force Daniel to confront the full weight of what he had truly lost. A fertility specialist, reviewing archived files for unrelated insurance purposes, recognized Grace's name and reached out to a colleague who had handled her case years earlier. After careful review, they confirmed something that should have been identified a decade prior. Grace's repeated miscarriages had not been the result of permanent infertility at all. She had been suffering from a treatable hormonal condition that, properly diagnosed and managed, would likely have allowed her to carry a pregnancy to term. And because Daniel had refused the second round of testing his own doctor had recommended years earlier, first out of fear, then because his mother insisted no real man needed such tests, his own contributing factors had never been properly investigated either. Word of this finding eventually reached Daniel through a mutual acquaintance. He sat with the information for hours, unable to process it, unable to escape the crushing weight of what it meant. Grace had never been the problem. His own untested, unexamined fertility, and his refusal to face it had been the true obstacle all along. Not Grace's body, not Grace's worth, as his mother had so cruelly insisted for years. The tragedy of his marriage to Grace had never been about infertility at all. It had been about deception, about pride, about a mother's relentless pressure and a son too afraid of the truth to insist on it, about a friend who chose secret longing over honesty, and a husband who chose silence over trust. The aftermath came swiftly. Daniel filed for divorce from Ada within months, unable to reconcile the foundation of lies their marriage had been built upon. Ada did not fight it. "I built our entire marriage on a lie," she admitted during their final conversation. "I told myself it was love. Really, it was fear. Fear of losing you, fear of becoming irrelevant the way Grace did. I see that now." "It doesn't change anything," Daniel replied quietly. "The damage is done." Mama Daniel, who had once celebrated the birth of her heir with such triumphant joy, was devastated when the truth reached her. The grandson she had pushed so hard to secure shared no biological connection to her family whatsoever. "I did this," she whispered to herself one evening, alone in her parlor. "I pushed my son into destroying his marriage for a grandchild who isn't even mine by blood. What have I done?" She lived the remainder of her years carrying that guilt like a stone lodged permanently in her chest. Daniel continued to care for the boy, of course. The child had done nothing wrong, had never asked to be born into a web of lies spun by adults chasing their own desires. Daniel made sure the boy never felt blamed, never felt rejected. Whatever else had collapsed around him, he refused to let an innocent child pay for sins that were never his. But for Daniel himself, joy became something that visited only in fleeting, fragile moments. Years later, on a warm Saturday afternoon, Grace stood in her backyard, surrounded by balloons and laughter, celebrating her youngest child's 7th birthday. Children ran across the grass, shrieking with delight as they chased each other around a brightly colored bounce house Michael had rented for the occasion. Michael approached from behind, wrapping his arms gently around her waist. "Happy?" he asked, kissing the top of her head. "More than I ever thought possible," Grace replied, leaning back into his embrace. Far away, in a quiet apartment that echoed with too much silence, Daniel sat alone in his study one evening, a glass of untouched whiskey beside him on the desk. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk slowly, the way a person opens something they've avoided for years. Inside lay Grace's old wedding ring, the one she had left on the coffee table the night she walked out. Beside it, their honeymoon photograph, edges curling with age. Beneath that, the very first ultrasound image, faded and soft from years of handling. And tucked in the corner, a tiny knitted baby cap Grace had bought after her first pregnancy, before either of them understood how much loss the years ahead would carry. He lifted each item slowly, one at a time, laying them out in front of him, like evidence in a trial only he was qualified to judge. Everything he had ever truly wanted, he realized, had already been in his hands. He had simply not been patient enough, honest enough, brave enough to hold on to it. He picked up the wedding photograph last, running his thumb over the glass, studying the youthful, hopeful faces staring back at him. "I traded forever," he whispered into the empty room, his voice breaking, "for a lie." He thought of Grace's laughter, the way she used to hum softly while cooking dinner, the way she had looked at him with complete, unguarded trust before everything fell apart. The tears came freely now, and he did not bother to stop them. He set the items back in the drawer, exactly as he'd found them, and sat in the gathering darkness, finally allowing himself to grieve everything he had lost. Some people lose their marriages because life deals them an unfair hand. Others lose everything because they forget, in moments of fear and pressure, that trust is more valuable than any child, any family legacy, any desperate attempt to please people who will never truly be satisfied. A family built on lies will always eventually collapse under its own weight. But a heart that chooses truth, even when truth is painful, even when truth costs relationships and comfort, can always find love again. Grace found that love. Daniel never did. If this story touched you, if it taught you something about the price of dishonesty and the power of choosing truth even when it costs us, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next story. Tell us, what would you have done in Grace's position? We read every single comment, and we'd love to hear your perspective. Thank you for watching until the very end. Until next time, remember, truth may be painful, but it is always worth choosing.